Gordon Houlden is going to lead us in this examination with panelists from Canada, as well as one who's come from the National Defense University of the People's Liberation Army. Gordon Houlden is the director of the China Institute, a professor of political science, both at the University of Alberta. He's been a minister in Beijing and Director General of the East Asian Bureau, and I leave things in your capable hands, sir.
Thank you very much, David. I think everyone in the audience would agree that we have some of the tougher questions, some of the more difficult ones. We've had the stage set for us very nicely by Dr. Huang. Security and intelligence issues, which are going to be covered by our panel, these touch on core issues of states. They're issues of sensitivity. They touch on sovereignty. And so they are, by definition, important, but also sometimes difficult to resolve because they involve set-piece, fundamental national interests. Our national experience as a country has been that our influence in the Asia-Pacific region, let's say the western side of the Pacific, has been historically rather modest. But when there has been a breakdown of security issues, we are affected immediately and seriously. And I'm thinking of 1941, where our rather raw troops were drawn into combat immediately with the Japanese. I'm thinking of 1950, when we found ourselves quickly drawn into the Korean War. And I'm thinking actually of 2001, when also we were engaged in combat in Afghanistan fairly shortly after events that in that 01-02 period. In each of these instances, without a lot of warning, without a lot of ability to avoid these challenges. That's our particular national experience. But I'll now turn to our panelists who are experts on all of these. I'm not going to follow the precise order, either alphabetical or in the proximity to me. And we're going to begin with Senior Colonel Guo, who's coming from the National Defense University of China. And I'd like you to make some opening remarks, Colonel, your perspective, some of the big picture thinking from Beijing, please.
Well, good morning, dear friends. Am I wrong? Actually, I have to tune to the time of Ottawa. I'm still in Beijing time, you know. So it's early morning in Beijing now. Actually, it's a kind of brainstorming interaction among the panelists. Actually, I feel somewhat my brain is coming to a standstill. So I will try my best to activate it. Okay. Before coming to Canada, I was not very sure whether I can come or not, because I got the invitation quite late. And also, according to the practice of the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, it requires for 3 working weeks for applying for the visa. So, and when I was told I was invited, I was not very sure whether I should prepare for this conference, this important conference. But anyway, I'm quite successful, and I'm here. I'm glad to be in Canada, this beautiful country, great country. Actually, 10 years ago, when I worked as visiting fellow in Georgetown University, I look at Canada from Niagara Falls, from the other side. But I've got a very terrible vision of the fall because I was not in Canada. So I wish to be able to come to Canada. Hereby, I wish to offer my personal understanding of the strategic landscape of the international system. In the past 20 years or so, the international society has undergone a time of changes. Actually, 20 years ago, when the former USSR collapsed, some people are talking about the coming of a unipolar world, and some people said that a multipolar world is coming, or was coming. But actually, it's somewhat difficult for me to define the nature of this international system. I would accept that it's a kind of combination of unipolar world with multipolar world. But actually, the process has not been concluded yet. So the world, the international system, is still undergoing a time of gradual transformation. Gradual transformation. During the process, there will be a lot of uncertainties. But from my personal understanding, in spite of the uncertainties there are some new dynamics in the international system. For example, economic globalization, transnational crimes, that means non-traditional security issues, as well as economic interdependency, not only in terms of economy, but also in terms of security. So in spite of the fact that there still exists a lot of wars, local wars or domestic conflicts worldwide, especially in some developing regions, but the new dynamics provided the world some kind of opportunities, because from my personal understanding, global economic globalization and interdependency, as well as transnational crimes, requires for cooperation among nations, because no single nation can deal with these new dynamics independently. So that calls for cooperation among nations. Actually, against the background of gradual transformation of the international system, there are some new aspects that worth mentioning. First is a kind of anarchy with improved governance in the international system. Because by its nature, present day, the international system is still in a state of anarchy. But in the past years, at least for 20 years to 2 decades, there has been some improvements, both at global level and regional level. At global level, the UN reforms has been put high on the agenda, but the process has been very slow. At regional level, regionalization, regional integration have already become a very strong momentum in different regions. So the governance, regional governance and global governance have been improved greatly. And the second point I wish to mention is that some emerging powers will be more important in the international arena. The emerging powers like China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, BRICS, and some other medium-sized emerging powers are playing more and more important role in the international arena. It's a kind of tendency we have to witness in the coming decades or so. And another important factor is the kind of the relative decline of the USA. But actually, I don't agree to the term the decline of the USA. The majority of the Chinese experts may accept the relative decline of the states. But actually, in spite of the fact that the USA is still the only superpower in the world with dominant power, but its ability compared to the early period after the ending of the Cold War, its capability to dominate, to control the international affairs have somewhat declined a little bit. So the USA cannot decide everything in international affairs. So above 3 aspects is what I have in mind. I wish to talk to you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel. What both links us, Canada, to Asia, and what separates us is the Pacific Ocean. I'd like now to turn to Dr. Manicom to perhaps make some comments on some of the maritime dimensions of the security issues that are in play for this panel. Please.
Sure. Thank you for the easy question. I thought Professor Huang set it up well. Unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, China has been perceived to be The media calls it assertive. I think the word reactive assertiveness is much more appropriate. China is seen to be responsible for the news headlines of the last 3 years. I think, leaving aside whether or not that's true and to what extent everyone, I think, in the region is responsible for what's been happening, I think this does present an interesting opportunity for Canada, an interesting challenge for the government, because for those that don't know, when the last time Canada was diplomatically active in East Asia, it was actually on the South China Sea questions. Ian Townsend Galt and Hassim Jalal, Ian is at UBC and Hassim Jalal is an ambassador to everything out of Indonesia, coordinated a series of bilateral, multilateral Track 2 dialogues on the South China Sea. And these are on record. The Americans appreciated this, the Chinese appreciated this, the Japanese appreciated this as a solid effort to build confidence between countries that were making claims to disputed space and didn't fully understand, I think, the legal implications of what they were doing. And so these dialogues were very much legal conversations about an emerging regime called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so when you go to the region now, there's a certain generation of policymaker in Southeast Asia in particular who will say, where's Canada on this now? Shouldn't you do this again? It doesn't cost you much. Is there an opportunity here for you to be active again? And in the scholarly community, this is something that we've been talking about, and I know that the government has been talking about it as well. Whether or not another multilateral Track 2 is the appropriate way to do that, to play a role, is an interesting question, because there are now a lot of multilateral Track 2s in Southeast Asia and in East Asia that discuss the maritime questions. And the politics of the maritime questions have changed a little bit. It's no longer that people don't understand the law of the sea, it's actually that they understand it quite well. And they're very good at framing their claims in that way. A second question is, should Canada involve itself in these questions at all? Now, I come down in the school that thinks that we should say or do something. Some people would suggest that perhaps it's not in our interests. We should just continue with our what will hopefully be a very fruitful economic relationship and economic overture to East Asia and Southeast Asia, and skip the question of maritime disputes and of broader security questions. But I do think, now my view is that this is a region where you need to have more than one axis to your diplomatic strategy. This is a region that needs you to play the long game. You need to come in there with a long-term plan. And they will look for more than just an economic transactional relationship. And so there is an opportunity for Canada as a maritime country, a country that polices an enormous exclusive economic zone with very scarce resources, a country that is quite literate in the law of the sea, to perhaps do a little bit of capacity building or engagement on the question of maritime security, and some of that relates to the sovereignty questions and the island disputes in East Asia. Perhaps not a direct arbitration or anything of that nature, but an opportunity to I think build ties between the various protagonists in maritime East Asia. And those protagonists, fortunately, are Coast Guards. Fortunately, they are not navies. There is an opportunity, I think, for Canada to build the capacity of Southeast Asian Coast Guards, excuse me, many of whom do not talk to one another and do not have the capacity to stay out at sea for a long time, or to do the kinds of things a modern Coast Guard can do. And there are sort of other ways that Canada can foster dialogue on regional fisheries management and those kinds of less sensitive but still very important questions that lie at the heart, unfortunately, of these maritime disputes in East Asia. So I view the maritime disputes as obviously a tragedy of power politics, but I do think they do present a certain opportunity for Canada at a time when we do want to re-engage East Asia.
Perhaps just following on quickly from that, I'm going to go right back to Senior Colonel Guo with a question. Is there a role in that large Asia-Pacific region, and particularly in the western side of it, for a small middle power that has a very small military, almost would be a rounding error compared to the size of the PLA? Senior Colonel Guo is an infantry officer by training, and PLA is, of course, the world's largest military. We're a small country by population, and we have a very small and modest military. Is there a role for a small country in that very large region with heavy battalions?
Well, actually, it's a very good question. The Asia-Pacific region is an area where major powers converge. So the rivalry or the kind of competition among major powers make the situation in the region more and more complicated. So from my personal point of view, medium-sized power have got a very good role to play. In the past years, especially in the past 2 decades, since the establishment of ASEAN Regional Forum, you can see the medium-sized power played a very important role because the major powers are suspicious over each other. For example, if China tried to take some kind of initiative in on some specific issues, the states will be suspicious of China. Japan will be also suspicious. So the medium-sized power have the kind of in a better position to work as a kind of mediator or go-between or something. So my understanding is that the medium-sized power can play a role. So that's why in the process of multilateral security cooperation at Pan-Pacific region, ASEAN Regional Forum, led by ASEAN countries, have been in a leading position. So from my personal understanding, in the past years, China has been supporting ASEAN of its leading role in the multilateral security cooperation. And of course, we can apply this kind of position to medium-sized power, such as Canada or some even or Australia or some other countries. So that is my personal understanding of your question.
Thank you, Colonel Guo. I think we're gradually moving from a larger picture to a little bit more focus on China itself. That is, after all, this is after all a China conference. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Sloan, who I think is going to give us both a large picture security view of Asia, but perhaps also make some comments, I would hope, on China's own capacity as a rising military power.
Yeah,
Please.
sure. Now, I also think that the speaker we had just before this panel was an excellent segue into this panel because perception and misperception in international politics comes to play. And I appreciate your comments on the role of a middle power. I think some of the things we need to think about are the rise in military capabilities on the part of China, and then the response that the United States has had on that, and then what kind of implications that has for Canada. When you look at the rise of Chinese military power, really you have to look at it over a 20-year time period. The informatization of military forces, the move towards smaller, more advanced technology military forces, focus away from the Army onto the Navy and the Air Force, especially on the Navy in the case of China, and sort of an expeditionary capability, the growth of submarines and destroyers, and we heard about the aircraft carrier. So a move outward on the part of China, and then what sort of response this has on the part of the United States. We've heard all sorts of things about the pivot, the US pivot. Well, what does that mean? It's focusing its naval capabilities to greater effect on the Asia-Pacific region, moving more of its carrier battle groups into place, building different kinds of assets. So all of that is happening with the United States, and also some kind of doctrine changes that that I'll spare you with the details of. All that to say is there is a perception of growth in Chinese military capabilities and a perception that there may be some kind of tension or challenge in this area. And this matters to Canada for two reasons. First, because of the economic dimension, China matters to Canada it's because China is a great power, and also because of our economic relationship. The United States matters to Canada because of its long-standing ally. All of this dynamic impacts Canada. So what does it mean? I really like the comments about the middle power aspect, the confidence and security building measures. I think Canada does have to be prepared for two sorts of scenarios. One which is not likely, I would say, but the possibility of a regional conflict that somehow draws in the United States, or if there's a regional conflict, what sort of a role would Canada play? Would we stay out completely? Would we participate in and if so, what kind of assets, et cetera, would we contribute? And also, I think the much more likely aspect is the reaching out, the securing the sea lines of communication. All of the trading nations have an important concern with making sure the sea lines of communication are maintained open, that there aren't terrorists, that there isn't piracy, drug trafficking, all the criminal activity. This is a major area of focus on the part of the United States and is a major area of focus, I know, of our own Canadian Navy. And I think there's great scope for cooperation between Canada and China in those sorts of areas.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Ray, I wonder if following up on those remarks in particular, and of course security involves many different dimensions. It involves military security, it involves intelligence security, some of the issues of which you've spoken quite recently upon. I wonder if you could make some general remarks, following up perhaps on the something that ties Canada with China, some of the challenges that we face in the region, both countries, and how this is affecting, in effect, national security on either side and in the region generally. Please.
No, pleasure. We've discussed this morning, and we heard through the two panels and through other presentations, there are a tremendous number of opportunities that lay before us. There is a very compelling case to be made for Canada to move towards emerging markets, particularly in Asia, and to move away from the traditional north-south axis of commercial activity. Through that, absolutely, I would not be one to stand and say, no, we should not engage in areas where we have no common sort of sets of criteria, we have no clear understanding as to the rules of engagement, or that could we actually ensure that intellectual property would be effectively protected, whether it's from a copyright perspective or from just protecting the know-how, the knowledge, the widget making formula to the actual methodology behind the marketing of some particular product. There certainly are a number of good reasons for us to engage in markets that are uncertain, unsure, and the value proposition has been clear to everybody over the last decade. There's clearly no doubt. But there are two elements I think that we should not overlook, and they're important in the larger set of considerations. There are some bright, shiny opportunities, but there are also many uncertainties that we need to focus in on. First of all, in the post-2008 economic reality, we find ourselves in a hyper-active, competitive environment. In other words, in my sense of my understanding of the business and looking how state actors have operated within those interests, in some cases, there have been no rules. There have been no rules, and there have been very aggressive attempts to acquire intellectual property through methods that would be seen as being less than legitimate in a traditional business sense. I think most Canadian companies and Canadian organizations are used to. The other factor is that it's the internet. It's that great amorphous thing that has transformed commerce over the last, certainly since the mid-90s. And that has been both the great enabler of business and likely its greatest Achilles heel. And through that, there have been a number of actors, some private, some are organized crime, some are that teenage, misguided young person sitting in somebody's basement who's working away just simply to do a denial of service attack because it just seemed like a cool thing to do. But there are also a number of state actors who are working either directly for organs of state, or they're working as proxies, or they do so for reasons of loyalty or whatever, who would work against certain interests or would be willing to share intellectual property at a cost for a fee, or because, again, it's the right thing for them to do. So why am I saying all this? Well, I think it's that thing that we rather not talk about, because I think as Canadians it makes us somewhat uncomfortable, unfortunately. We also want to ensure that nothing gets in the way of possible prosperity. I absolutely get that, and I certainly want to make sure that people who have been in my business previously, when I worked for CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the big part of the enterprise was about enabling effective risk management, understanding what's at risk, develop mitigation strategies, assure yourself the prize is still worth it, and then work towards that objective. Very simple formula, and it's one I think that's guided many businesses today to great success. So that's all that I want to underline, is at the end of the day, we're in a whole new 21st century economy. We've seen tremendous impact points. They're unique, they're new. Many of them are very difficult to understand. Many of them involve considerable subterfuge. But if we're not careful, if we're not thoughtful about that, it could undermine our future prosperity. And prosperity, they should be built for quite jointly with a number of new partners. And I think the discussions this morning about finding a form of synergy with partners where we can complement one another. And I think there's probably no better example than the Canadian-Chinese relationship. I think economically that's very true. There are great things to be developed in terms of future pathways that will lead to, I believe, great prosperity for both countries. But also recognizing that all countries, whether they're emerging partners or traditional partners, have interests. And some of them will pursue those interests extremely aggressively and assertively. And I think sometimes if there is a bit of naivety, there'll be consequences.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly agree with one thing you did say, and that it's probably best not to ignore these things. I think in this forum it's possible to respectfully discuss these challenges and not to ignore the large elephant in one corner of the room. I think that's a safer approach. I wonder, James, though, if I could turn to you. And these are, Ray has been speaking about non-traditional security threats, some of which, as in the internet, did not exist 30 years ago. These are brand new territory we're in. But from your perspective, how big a threat to the relationship, but also to our own security, and to China's security, are some of these non-traditional threats, which are not navies driving large weapon systems in the Pacific, but rather things that come down tubes and wires, or wireless?
You know, the non-traditional, or the non-state threats, if you like, are the ones that I worry the most about, because, you know, I'm confident that the other end of a given Navy ship, there's a well-trained commander who's got a phone to a rational political leader, and cooler heads will prevail. The non-traditional security stuff, cyber, perhaps is a bit, you worry more. Another dimension to the non-traditional side is the stuff that does not have a human component, environmental security, climate-related challenges, and we're beginning a project at my institution that'll hopefully look at some of that, because the entire region, the entire Pacific Basin, is very vulnerable to environmental challenges, environmental crises. We've seen that off the coast of Japan. Not that an earthquake is an environmental crisis, but you can see what happens when you have extensive flooding and tsunamis in Japan, floods in the Philippines, creates relocations of peoples, sometimes relocations of peoples across borders, particularly in South Asia. And the concern that I have, and I think the concern that any Canadian or international person should really have, is that the regional institutions aren't necessarily set up to deal with these kinds of things. The regional architecture in East Asia is very much a state-centric architecture about meetings between countries, but they focus on economic issues and very limited focus on traditional security issues, and virtually no focus on things like migration challenges and the consequences of environmental challenges, not least of which, of course, is preventing environmental challenges as well. So the non-traditional security side of the security picture is complex, it's enormous, and it's not something that I think we have thought through very carefully. Probably because, of course, governments don't have the time and resources to do the kind of long-term thinking that requires that. And some of these problems, particularly the cyber question and the environmental security question, from a simple expertise standpoint, transcend the traditional areas of academic expertise. I do a PhD in political science, but to talk about environmental security, I have to start familiarizing myself with environmental security. That's just one example. But these things they cross issue areas, and so they are much more complicated to deal with. So that's one of the reasons I worry about them, is we haven't thought them through, and we're not as prepared to think them through just by virtue of the way we train the people who think about these issues.
Thank you. And I'd like to follow up that particular point on cyber threats and non-traditional threats to security with Senior Colonel Guo. Colonel, you will be aware of course, polemics between Washington and Beijing over the question of who's responsible for this and who is doing this, what to whom. These are things, I'm guessing, when you first went to military college, were not front and center in the PLA thinking. You're now in a very large military think tank, security think tank in Beijing. I presume the PLA, the people like yourselves who do thinking on security issues, these are now things which you have to consider. They have effects not only on civilian infrastructure, but potentially military units as well. What are your thoughts on these non-traditional security threats of the 21st century, which we're now seeing so much of?
Well, actually, I do agree with what our two panelists say about non-traditional security issues. Actually, in the past years, generally speaking, China suffered a lot from non-traditional security issues, including cyber threats, including transnational crimes like terrorism, pandemic disease, environmental degradation, something like that. Actually, from my personal point of view, yesterday I made a joke with, I don't know who I made with. I said nowadays the concept of global warming is a kind of hypothetic, highly hypothetic. It's not global cooling. Because just 3 days ago, Beijing has got the heaviest snow in the past 40 years. So actually, it's somewhat different people have different opinions about that. But the one thing is sure is that the issue of environmental problem will have strong influence upon the future of the relationship among nations, because environmental issues cannot be dealt with only a country or independently. So it calls for cooperation. Actually, from my personal point of view, the international society has voiced their common interest, their common desire for cooperation in that regard. For example, in the year 2003, China signed a memorandum with ASEAN countries as regarding to non-traditional security issues. And also 10+3, that is ASEAN 10 countries with Japan, ROK, and China also have already initiated information sharing on non-traditional security issues. So actually, I'm sure the kind of cooperation, regional cooperation and global cooperation will be enhanced in the future. So that is my understanding of it.
Please.
Okay. I was just thinking something that Senior Colonel just mentioned is it resonated with me just from a personal experience wherein I think of some of the allied partnerships that CSIS managed in terms of the post-9/11 environment, where counterterrorism was the driver for many discussions, the sharing of knowledge about terrorist entities that were emerging out of Somalia, for example, Al-Shabaab, and perhaps some things going on in West Africa. They were new to Canada. They were suddenly important to us. We had a number of kidnappings in some parts of the world that were driving the program I was responsible for. It came down to several of my travels and engaging even with some very established Western intelligence service partners whom I know were also aggressive collectors of foreign intelligence of a commercial nature. And it was amazing how, in one particular case, I remember it hit me because in a discussion where I knew I touched the right nerve, wherein they said, rest assured, your knowledge, what Canada knows and understands that part of the world is so crucial for us, we will do nothing in future to betray Canada's sovereignty. So I had to think of a couple things. One was something going on domestically in Canada at the time, but also with respect to what they were alleged to have been doing very aggressively in the international environment, picking off the best ideas and some of the best kept trade secrets from some of those competitors. And this was exactly that model of a state entity, such as an intelligence service or a security organization, that's collecting intelligence that would be used by either a state-owned enterprise or companies that are friendly or aligned to the party in power or whatever, and then they would be able to gain access to that privileged information and knowledge and drive it back into the business to gain an economic advantage. What made the difference was the cooperation and collaboration. In this case, there's nothing like a shared threat or a shared requirement between whether it's two armies in terms of dealing with certain issues or whether it's two intelligence services. So my point is, I think collaboration, increasing the level of collaboration and cooperation in areas between Canada and China where there are mutual interests will, I think, go a considerable degree in satisfying some of the perceptual challenges we have, and perhaps to normalize some of the areas around the whole issue of cyber. And that includes rules of engagement.
I'll go very quickly to Senior Colonel Guo and then to the others, but on this question of collaboration. And of course, the title of our group is Building Confidence. There has been a not yet fully fleshed out proposal from Beijing recently on questions of cyber issues, urging there to be greater collaboration, standard setting, et cetera. And I wonder if you could just touch on that, Senior Colonel, as to can there be a collaborative response to these insecurities and non-conventional threats?
Well, actually, the internet is a kind of thing that cannot be controlled by a single country. So, from my personal understanding, I'm not a technician. I'm not so sure about that. But from my personal understanding, the great majority of the service computers are located in the USA, and sometimes, the states claim that China is trying to intrude into U.S. computers and networks or something like that. But also, just a couple of days ago, China said that half of the intrusions happening inside China were conducted by U.S. servers. So actually, it's a kind of dilemma. We cannot be sure that who has done the work. Sometimes the servers or the computer in China might be hijacked by external computers and to conduct such kind of things, cyber attacks. So there should be some kind of collaboration among nations, not only between China and the USA, but also among the major countries, especially the major countries that have the ability, in technology, to reach some kind of understanding how to protect, how to join hands in fighting against such kind of crimes. So that is a good idea.
Eleanor, please.
I wanted to touch not on cyber, but on other areas of irregular threats, non-traditional threats. Apart from cyber, you can look at piracy and terrorism, that kind of thing. And I think the idea of cooperation, collaboration between China and Canada is really important. If you look at some of the skills that the Canadian Forces has, for example, in the post-9/11 period, it was involved in an operation called Op Apollo, interdicting terrorists in the Gulf of Arabia. That's the kind of thing that might need to be done again, and I know that there are exercises between China and the United States. I was just reading counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden. That's the kind of thing that I think Canada and China could potentially do on a bilateral military-to-military basis, outside of the big RIMPAC exercise, just on a bilateral side. Also, disaster relief. There was this tsunami. We sent our disaster assistance response team to Sri Lanka back in 2004. So disaster response is perhaps an area where Canada and China could exercise or collaborate in some way.
David, could you please follow on that particular point?
I'd like to reinforce that. I mean, I'm a big proponent of joint exercises between navies, but the cold hard reality is that we don't have the money to send our Navy to Asia, every year. We go every couple of years and do a port visit. The great thing about the Gulf of Aden is that we're there, and the Chinese are there, and the South Koreans are there, the Japanese are there. There's a lot of navies there, collaborating, interacting. And it would be nice to see a more regular naval interaction between Canada and China in particular, but other navies as well, in that area, since we're in the area. And to the point about humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, both joint exercises and humanitarian assistance, disaster relief have sort of underwritten the Australian approach to their military engagement with China. They've done joint exercises on the Chinese mainland in Sichuan province, as well as naval exercises. And I don't want to preach the do what the Aussies do, because I don't necessarily think that's appropriate for Canada all the time. But certainly when it comes to building military ties with Canada, with China, the Australians have been able to do that while maintaining their status as a U.S. ally without any kind of question from the Americans. So I think that these kinds of exercises are a very important way forward for Sino-Canadian cooperation.
Before we go to question, I'm going to go very briefly back to more traditional security threats. And of course, these are very large economies. 2/3 of the world's population almost is in Asia. Big economies, large militaries, very capable militaries. I'm going to go through all four panelists asking, what is the risk, given that we're not in a Cold War situation with a lot of elaborate verification systems, et cetera, what is the risk that we may be entering an arms race in Asia, large militaries looking very nervously at their neighbors and building faster, more capable forces of that, and what risk does that pose? Very quickly, I know this is an area of your particular expertise, but I'll give each panelist a couple minutes only before we go to questions, please.
Okay, sure. Well, I do think there's a security dilemma in place, and I guess I teach international politics, so I have to sort of give sort of that perspective. And I think there is the potential for an arms race in Asia, just by the nature of the international system. Now, so the increase on the part of the Chinese military and its capabilities as a natural outgrowth of a rise as a great power, it's a sensible way for things to proceed. But then the US response and then the response of countries in that area, I think that is definitely in play. And the way you have to go about trying to reduce the security dilemma and address it and make sure that it doesn't get to a stage that you don't want it to is through these collaborative methods, through confidence and security building measures, through port calls, through staff talks, through joint exercises, all that kind of thing.
James, please.
If Eleanor says there's no arms race, there's no arms race, because she's the expert. I would suggest there might be an arms competition. And you know, an arms race in the 1911 use of the term arms race between the US and China would have China building all kinds of aircraft carriers to match American aircraft carriers, the way there was a dreadnought battleship arm race back then. But an arms competition has China building military hardware that is designed to complicate the operations of aircraft carriers because China perceives a threat from those aircraft carriers. So there is a competition. Both the United States and China know that. And the ways around that are deeper military ties, not just between China and US allies, which I think is a place where Canada can add value, but there is a need for deeper military relations between the US and China. Regrettably, those are held hostage to a variety of very tense bilateral issues. I'm encouraged that China has been invited to attend RIMPAC 2014. I hope that invitation will stand until then, and I hope it doesn't get revoked or get canceled by one party or another. So I'm actually quite encouraged by that development, because I think both Washington and Beijing now recognize just how important it is to build that transparency between the two, navies in particular, but militaries generally.
Yes, and that's cooperation on disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, not on the war-fighting aspects, but still a step forward.
Thank you. Senior Colonel Guo.
Well, actually, so far as I can understand, the international society has been kept on nervous eyes on the kind of arms build-up especially in East Asia, right? In the past years, actually one of the focal points is China. But actually, from a personal understanding, the arms build-up or army construction or defense construction in China is a kind of recovering process, because in the initial stage of our economic reforms, the PLA has to suffer a lot in order to give way for economic development. We reduced our budget in terms of percentage. It accounted for in the national budget, you know, and actually after 1995, I mean the Taiwan Strait crisis, China realized that it is very important. Otherwise, it is very important for us to push forward our defense construction. Otherwise, we cannot stop Taiwan from splitting from mainland. So that is the kind of the start of Chinese resuming its momentum of defense construction. That is the initial stage. Up to now, actually, this year, our defense budget is around 720 billion RMB yuan. That is about 110 billion US dollars. 10 billion US dollars. Still, it just accounts for less than 1.5% of Chinese GDP. You can see what's the percentage of US defense budget in its GDP. It accounts for around 4%. And also, you know, China has got the problem of actually very difficult problem of maintaining sovereignty, especially to prevent the separation of Taiwan, in spite of the fact that in the past years, especially after Ma Ying-jeou took office in Taiwan, there has been some kind of improvements in the relations across the Taiwan Strait. But still, there will be some kind of uncertainty. We have to make sure if something happened across the Taiwan Strait, we can react. It's a kind of domestic issue rather than an international issue. So actually, the PLA must be prepared for the worst scenario. For the worst scenario. Actually, in the past years, China have got a lot of disputes, territorial disputes with Japan, with the Philippines, with Vietnam. But actually, from my personal understanding, in the past 20 years, over 20 years, China has got no armed skirmishes, even skirmishes with its neighboring countries. So that shows the kind of efforts being made by Chinese government to preserve peace and stability in the region. And also, China has made efforts in solving land territorial disputes with the majority of the countries concerned. Actually, we have 14 neighbors inland, you know. Among them, 13 of them has already solved disputes with China. Only exception is India. And also the two governments has already reached a consensus on politically solution through diplomatic negotiation. So actually, the kind of arms race just now, Mr. Houlden talked about arms race. Well, actually, I surmise whether there, I feel somewhat. I don't think there is a kind of arms race. Actually, from my personal point of view, actually, it is not in the interest of China to engage in a kind of arms race with USA. You know, in terms of GDP, in terms of per capita income, it is impossible for China to engage in a kind of arms race with the USA. And also, the Cold War experiences of the former USSR told us that China should not engage in a kind of arms race with any country. So it's a kind of natural process for China to strengthen its defense forces. It's not aimed at engaging in any kind of arms race with other countries, including the States.
Thank you, Colonel. Just before you speak, I must admit you attracted my sympathy with one remark, Senior Colonel, when you spoke about 14 neighbors. And Canada has its hands full managing a complicated relationship with one near neighbor. The idea of 14 is, you have a very big challenge. Ray, please.
I guess in terms of traditional threats, and I guess looking at the decade to come, I'd be remiss to overlook what has been really a preoccupation over the last decade. And there's still some lingering counterterrorism concerns that affect both China and Canada, or Western interest in general. There's been a resurgence or a recouping of capability or capacity by a number of Sunni Islamic extremist groups in Southeast Asia and beyond. I think that's something that would preoccupy all parties in the foreseeable future. I think the impact, incipient nature of transnational crime is another big concern of mine, and I think it's something we all must be wary of. But finally, I have to go back to, of course, the topic that's been underlined for my initial statement is that fifth dimensional warfare piece. I think cyber could be catastrophic only in the sense that the Colonel mentioned very clearly that it's the issue of attribution. It remains very elusive, but it's critical for all of us to be able to have some certainty as to who are the real threat actors at that level in terms of cyber. I could foresee a moment, it sounds like perhaps a poor sequel of a James Bond movie that was dropped because it was just too crazy, but could you see that evil mastermind and see that evil group of people who would mastermind an attack on a critical infrastructure node somewhere in North America, perhaps Canada, perhaps it's the electrical grid, perhaps it's oil and gas delivery systems in the middle of February, and you could see where suddenly somebody is blamed, but they not be at fault. And I think at the end of the day, we'll have to be very mindful of establishing these rules for us to better manage that cyber environment. And also, perhaps, whether it's somehow subscribing to a code of conduct and ethics, and having that trust but deeply verified version of that would be perhaps useful. But I think given the current situation, there's a lot of blame going around, and there are a number of counter-accusations. I think some of them stick, and I think it's legitimate as well. You mentioned that China has been a victim of cyber attacks as well. I have no doubts it has been, because it comes back to my statement about we live in a hyper-competitive economic environment. And countries and even private companies will contract certain tools which would allow them to gain that deep business intelligence or that deep business insight, and they'll do that to the detriment of others who may not be practicing that particular art or may not be properly defending against it. So at the end of the day, as I've told many Canadian companies I've had engagements with, it's not a question of not engaging foreign markets. You must do so, but do so with your eyes wide open and do so effectively by mitigating the threats, which are real. They may not be easily perceived, but they're very real. And they come from a number of countries, and it's not just China. There are a number of countries who are adversely affecting Canadian intellectual property, therefore Canadian economic interests.
Well, thank you. I take your point that where you have, be it state actors or non-state actors, where you have threats emerging or attacks, cyber attacks, where you don't even know who it is behind it, that adds its own risks potentially, depending how serious they are. Senior Colonel, when you mentioned Taiwan, I was reminded of a comment made to me in 2005 by a senior US diplomat. I actually agreed with this comment. This was a time of some tension between Beijing and Washington over Taiwan, and his comment was simply a war between the United States and China over Taiwan would, quote, spoil the 21st century. I'm fortunate that most of the discussion here has not been in such apocryphal terms, but I think it does remind us that these risks are there and that they need to be addressed and contained. We now move to question period, and I'd welcome people to come to the mics. I would ask, perhaps, if the questions be rather succinct. If you could identify yourself first. A succinct question allows us to engage more questions, which I think we can agree is desirable. Please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Ray Snook. I'm, despite my accent, I am a serving member of the Royal Canadian Navy. And it's on that topic I'd like to expand, first with a statement and then a very quick question. Firstly, a statement in the fact that, draw your attention to earlier today, it was raised by one of the keynote speakers that there had been joint ship visits between China and Canada. We've crossed paths, certainly, off the coast of Somalia in conducting operations of mutual interest or mutual concern, i.e. counter-piracy. Perhaps a little less well known is the fact that both Canada and China are members of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. And the last time all the admirals got together in October last year, at the big dinner at the end of the conference, who should be sitting between the Japanese admiral and the chief of staff of the Chinese Navy, but Admiral Madison, rather than the US admiral. So the process of engagement and the process of building of trust and all the rest of it has started. It takes time, and that's all I'll say on that one. There are good reasons why the Navy is the best vehicle to engage in that, and I can expand on that offline. My question is relevant to something that's been conspicuous by its absence today, and that's the Arctic. And you're well aware that China has aspirations of joining the Arctic Council. and we should find an answer on that in the next couple of months. My question, particularly to the Colonel, but to others, is what is it that China can bring to the table around the Arctic? And what would you say to the skeptics that are a little bit fearful of your agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, you identified yourself as a naval officer, and of course that is the senior service for Britain, but the Colonel and I, speaking last night, agreed in the case of China, the PLA Army is the senior service, the part which he belongs to. But please, we'll first go to you, Senior Colonel, on the question that was asked in relation to the Arctic, please.
Well, actually, perhaps I'm sitting in the wrong place because I'm becoming a focal point. Well, actually, from my personal understanding, yesterday I told Mr. Houlden, actually in the year 1928, there was a treaty regarding Arctic. Actually, China was one of the signatory countries of this treaty. And as regard to the membership in the Arctic Council, actually, so far as I know, China wishes to join the council, but actually some member countries wishes China in, and some opposed to give membership to China. Actually, from my personal understanding, the Arctic area is one of the core interests for the countries concerned, like Canada, Norway, Russia. Actually, there have been some kind of competition there. It's just actually it's a kind of competition not only among the states surrounding Arctic area, Arctic pole. Some outsiders also wish to voice their interest in it. So actually, before the status of the Arctic pole, the area of surrounding Arctic pole can be determined, I think actually the international society should find a way how to define the status in the area so that to avoid the kind of competition or even conflicts. So that is my personal understanding of the question. I'm not an expert in that regard.
Thank you, James.
Frankly speaking.
Thank you very much, Colonel. James?
I just wanted to add my 2 cents on China and the Arctic Council, because China has Arctic interests the way any country that wants to ship things or burn oil and gas or use diamonds and iron ore would in the Arctic. But it doesn't need the Arctic Council to pursue those interests. So I, for one, welcome China to the Arctic Council because it doesn't need the Arctic Council to do what it wants to do there. And so if we want to involve China in the Arctic way of doing things, if there is such a thing, I would propose that letting them join the Arctic Council along with Japan and South Korea, and I shudder to say the EU as well, into the Arctic Council is probably going to do less harm than we think it will, and certainly do a great deal of good.
Perhaps we'll go to the next question. John Higginbottom, please.
Hi. This is directed at Colonel Gohl, who unfortunately does get the most of the attention here because we have these other people all the time. You're a good target here. But just actually in this hotel about a month ago, there was a very good defense and security conference, and the U.S. commander of the Pacific Fleet was here, Admiral Locklear, who gave, I thought, a very balanced and careful discussion of long-term strategic trends in the Pacific. He talked more about the rebalancing of U.S. defense postures in the Pacific because, quote, our military had got out of shape because of Afghanistan and Iraq. So it was more a case of returning to what was always a major priority of the United States since World War II, and not necessarily an increase at all of defense capabilities. He didn't really promise that at all in respect, and if one looks at what's happening to U.S. defense budgets as planned reductions and what's happening under the new sequestration policies, it's very hard to see the United States as expanding its total force in the Pacific area. The second thing he mentioned was how much he supported multilateral dialogue wherever it happened, whether it was ASEAN or summits or Track 2 or anywhere else. He was very much in favor of multilateralism and very much in favor of, in no way saying he was out to contain China. He was there, but very much arguing a need for transparency and an assumption of responsibilities by China for going an extra mile in terms of confidence building as its power increases. He also raised a couple of very specific worries, and one was the situation in the South China Sea. As a naval man, he knew the risks of very important strategic decisions being taken by some captain on one side or another, which would have very serious consequences. So he argued for codes of much better communication and codes of conduct through ASEAN and others. The other thing he worried about in the region most, he said, was Korea, North Korea. He didn't mention Taiwan. He was worried about the nuclearization of North Korea, also probably indirectly the waning confidence of some people in South Korea of the American commitment to South Korea, the nuclear commitment to South Korea. All of these were very interesting and and I think very positive for the future, these comments that I heard from him. Now, no doubt there's always different arguments, but the United States does see itself as having played a basically stabilizing role in the Pacific for many, many, many years. And you have to be sure if that's going to be gradually reduced, that it is replaced by something equally positive. He asked if a new Chinese carrier arrives off a crisis in a regional power, will it instill as much confidence as is often the case in the case of a US carrier?
I think in fairness to the Colonel, we'll go first to the Colonel. I apologize for the fact that you're drawing a lot of the friendly fire, but we'll go first to you, and then others may want to pick up on just a piece of that. We have another questioner waiting, of course. Senior Colonel, please.
Well, actually, I feel somewhat regretful at not being able to take part in the conference, the state conference. Actually, the remarks by Xinning is very encouraging for me. Actually, I did not notice the kind of the contents of this conference, but if the remarks he made is in such a way that it will be very conducive to the bilateral relationship between China and the USA. Actually, the bilateral relationship between China and USA is regarded as one of the most important bilateral relations in the world, especially in the Asia Pacific. Actually, there is one expert in China who said that if the relationship between China and the USA is not stable, the Asia Pacific will not be Pacific. So, so it is very important for China and USA to engage more in communication. Actually, in the year 2007, when I visited, actually at that time I was deputy director of the Institute for Strategic Studies in National Defense University. I took part in a bilateral dialogue with our counterpart in the USA, that is Institute for National Strategic Studies in NDU of USA. I put forward C4, the concept of C4. That is, number one, confidence. Number two, communication. Number three, coordination. And number four, cooperation. So actually, the concept is still relevant today. we are still in the process of confidence building. And also in the Asia Pacific, the regional states should engage more in confidence building measures, especially as regard to how to define regional security threats. Because, according to the Euro practices under the framework of our ASEAN Regional Forum, AIF each year publish a small pamphlet. Actually, this pamphlet collected the security outlook of the member countries. So that is very, very important, so that the member countries can understand each other. We have different understanding of the security issues in the region. We have different interests, and we should find ways to avoid the areas of possible conflicts and cultivate the areas of common interest so that we can create a more harmonious region in the Asia Pacific.
Alondra, do you have 30 seconds or a minute just to add a quick comment to that before we go to our last short question?
Sure. I was just going to comment on the arms race aspect of the questioners. He made a very good point that the U.S. defense budget is not going up, it's going down. So when you had asked earlier, is there an arms race in the Asia Pacific? Well, the defense budgets on the part of China and many of the regional countries are going up, but not on the part of the United States. And so that's a good news story if you're looking at overall, if you're comparing it to a Cold War situation. We're not seeing that. What the United States is doing is reallocating its assets from one side of the world to the other side, balancing it out, and also focusing more on not only just the sort of spoken wheel traditional alliances from the Cold War period, Japan, South Korea, etc., but also a dialogue with India, and I was reading recently a dialogue with China, so also a good news story.
Thank you. We'll now go to our last short question, and if it could be rather short, we can have just
Yes,
a little bit more
course.
time for the answer. Please, and identify yourself. Thank
Just given, my name is Andrew Miller, I work for the Parliament of Canada. Just a question following up on the recent disturbing developments in North Korea. Its withdrawal from the armistice and its very, very aggressive bellicose behavior. I was wondering if there's been a shift in public opinion in China on whether or not supporting that hermit kingdom is still in the Chinese people's interest going forward. Of course, if the Colonel can speak on that, that would be great.
Again,
Actually, it's
Colonel,
a good
please.
question. Yes, actually, it's a good question. The past decade has witnessed the kind of the cycle of escalation of tension on the Korean Peninsula. Well, actually, the basic position of China is quite clear. China wishes to see a peaceful and stable Korean Peninsula. Second, China wishes to see a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And China wishes to maintain stable relationship both with ROK and the DPRK. So that is the basic position of China. But how to achieve that end? How to achieve that end? Actually, in the past years, China has made painstaking efforts in order to bring the related parties together. 6 party talks in the year 2005. I think in September, the 6 party talks reached an agreement, and also some kind of cooperation. 5 working groups were established, and in spite of the achievement, in the year 2006. The DPRK conducted its first nuclear test, and then conducted the second, then the third one. So actually, from my personal point of view, many Western observers think that China have a decisive influence upon the DPRK. But from my personal point of view, the DPRK is a sovereign state. China's policy towards other countries is non-interference in internal affairs of other countries. So China will not say that you should not do this, should not do that. But actually, we've tried to persuade the DPRK to exercise some kind of constraints as regard to nuclear issues. But we failed to failed in our attempts. Why? You may ask why. One reason is China's influence upon the DPRK is limited. Second is the security reality on the Korean Peninsula. That is my personal point of view. In order to address the root causes of the instability, the sense of instability in the minds of the DPRK's leadership, we must take into consideration of its legitimate security concern. Why? In terms of balance of military power along the DMZ, you can see, in terms of conventional forces, RK alone is superior to that of the DPRK. It's a reality, not to speak the military presence of the USA. Actually, I strongly opposed the DPRK's position in area of nuclear weapons development. But we must take into consideration of the kind of legitimate security concerns of the DPRK. If we cannot address, we cannot help the DPRK leaders to get rid of the kind of sense of insecurity, then the cycle of proliferation cannot be stopped. So in the process, actually, I think in the year 2006, in October, immediately after the first nuclear test, I participated in a conference sponsored by National Defense University of the ROK. Actually, the director of the Institute for Security Studies in the KNDU said that the other 5 parties should take some kind of action. That means the 5 members of the 6-party talks, namely China, USA, Japan, Russia, and ROK, should take joint efforts to join hands to contain the DPRK. So actually, from my personal point of view, if China agreed to join these efforts, then the international society will lose a kind of bridge between China and ROK, as well as the USA and Japan. So I don't think the kind of coercive actions or pressure, strong pressure, can solve the issue. Actually, there is a kind of tale, Roman tale, which tells that the wind said, "I'm stronger." The sun said, "I'm stronger." Then they compete with each other. Who wins the game? The sun. You know, they try to, at first, the wind tried to blow off the clothes worn by a man, but it's impossible. The stronger the wind, the tighter the clothes will be. The sun slowly warming it up, and when the man feels it's extremely hot, then naturally he took off the overcoat. So for the solution of the DPRK nuclear issue or Korean nuclear issue is that we should adopt a kind of inclusive security dialogue rather than exclusive security dialogue. And also the process should be gradual at a pace comfortable to the DPRK, because China have got similar experiences 20 years ago when we were relatively an enclosed society. We just don't know, especially at the initial stage of the opening up to the outside world, we just don't know what's going to happen when we adopt open door policy. Actually, there is a famous saying by Deng Xiaoping which says that when you open the window, the fresh air will come in, and also as well as mosquitoes. So actually, we should assure the DPRK people that there is no danger in the international system. We can assure their survival. Actually, Obama seems more friendly to the DPRK because the former president, George W. Bush, always talk about rogue states or regime change. This kind of offending language cannot be, by no means accepted by Asian people. I mean, the countries in Asia. So you should take into consideration of the kind of culture, take into consideration of the specific situation inside the DPRK. So we should create the kind of easy atmosphere to accept the DPRK into the international society. So that is my basic understanding of the issue.
I thank the last
sorry
question.
for Nancy.
No, thank you,
Too
Colonel.
much.
Thank you very much for that last questioner. I was actually afraid we would get through the whole program without the Korean Peninsula becoming prominent. That did not happen. Just before I thank our four panelists, or we collectively thank our four panelists, I would like to highlight the role of Senior Colonel. We've learned this afternoon that he had little time to prepare. He had to wait for his Canadian visa. He had to fight his way through snowstorms in both Beijing and in Ottawa, and he's had to ward off jet lag as well. But for all four of our panelists, for Ray, for Xinning, for James, and for Eleanor, please join me in thanking all four for their contributions.